Life for a medieval farmer was nothing like the peaceful picture most people imagine. It was not calm, it was not easy, and it was far from simple. Before you start thinking you could handle it, you might want to take a closer look, because once you understand what it truly involved, your confidence might fade fast. Every morning began on land that would never belong to you. Not that day, not ever. For medieval farmers, this was not a temporary hardship, but a permanent reality. Around 9 out of 10 were tenant workers, tied to land that belonged to someone else and forced to trade their strength, crops, and time for the right to survive. In return, they received no ownership and no escape. Owning your own land? That was nearly impossible. The farming class was trapped in a cycle that repeated for centuries, working the same soil under the same lords with little hope of freedom. The local lord owned nearly everything, and selling farmland was not in his plans. Historical records from medieval England show that fewer than 5% of farmers ever managed to buy property of their own. The game was fixed from the start, and even the land they did work was often poor quality. If the soil of the Middle Ages could speak, it would probably sigh in exhaustion. The most fertile fields were reserved for the lord's household, while common farmers were left with stony, thin, and overused plots that fought back against every plow. Wooden plows often broke on the rocks, and sloping ground meant that a single storm could wash away months of work. The way farmland was divided made things worse. Instead of a single large field, each farmer had many narrow strips scattered all over the countryside. A day's labor often meant walking several miles between plots. Medieval peasants were logging serious mileage long before fitness trackers existed. Then there was the shared pasture land known as the commons. This was where villagers grazed their animals and collected firewood, but it was never guaranteed. The local lord could take it away at any time, leaving families without vital resources. During the enclosure movement, many peasants lost these rights altogether when lords fenced off the commons for their private profit. Their homes were no better than their fields. Most farmers lived in rough timber-framed huts packed with wattle and daub, a mix of mud, straw, clay, and animal dung. Roofs were made of straw or reeds tied together, which leaked badly whenever it rained. Inside, the floor was nothing more than packed dirt. No tiles, no wood, just bare ground underfoot. After days of rain, it turned to mud. The open floor plan so admired today was not a design trend back then. It was simply one room where everyone lived, cooked, and slept together. Few houses had chimneys. Fires for cooking and heating burned in the center of the floor, and the smoke was meant to drift out through a hole in the roof. In reality, it filled the air inside, leaving everyone coughing and blinking through a haze of soot. Examinations of medieval skeletons have revealed black residue inside the lungs, proof of a lifetime spent inhaling smoke. Vermin were a daily nuisance. Rats, mice, and insects made their homes alongside humans. Drawn by stored food and the warmth of livestock, they were often brought indoors during the winter months. Fleas were everywhere, so common that medieval records barely mentioned them. When something broke in your home, there was no carpenter to call. Repairs were handled by the family using whatever scraps they could find. Money was scarce, so improvisation was a survival skill. And when it came to food, there was little comfort to be found there either. The medieval farmer's diet was repetitive, bland, and barely nutritious. Most meals revolved around bread and stew, eaten day after day until it became routine. The daily meal might include a hunk of coarse bread so hard it could damage your teeth, and a bowl of thin vegetable stew known as pottage. Wheat was often replaced with cheaper grains like rye or barley, creating a dark, heavy loaf filled with grit from the millstones used to grind it. This was not a special hardship meal. It was breakfast, lunch, and dinner repeated for a lifetime. Over time, the gritty bread wore down teeth so badly that archaeologists have found medieval skeletons with flattened enamel and missing molars before the age of 30. Eating was less about enjoyment and more about endurance. In a world where every bite came with the taste of dirt and effort, survival itself was the main course. Meat was a rare indulgence for most medieval farmers, something they might only taste a few times a year. Records from manorial estates reveal that a peasant household might enjoy meat only on special occasions, such as religious festivals, or when an animal became too weak to keep. Chicken was the most common meat, not out of preference, but because it was the cheapest option when the local lord demanded food for a banquet. The cold season brought what villagers grimly called the hunger months. From January to April, food stores dwindled and fields lay barren. In this lean period, between 20 and 30% of children in certain communities did not live to see spring. Those who survived often grew weaker, lost body weight, and became more vulnerable to disease. Preserving food added to the struggle. Without cold storage, salt was the main method for keeping meat edible, yet salt was costly and heavily taxed. Few peasants could afford enough salt to cure meat properly for winter. Instead, they dried vegetables by hanging them from beams and prayed they would not rot before drying. Grain was kept in large clay jars or wooden bins, but rodents and insects often consumed a large portion long before the family could. When crops failed, it was like an economic crash with no safety net. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 wiped out about 10% of northern Europe's people after relentless rains ruined harvests for 2 years straight. Farmers had no emergency shipments to rely on. Their version of fast food was whatever they could gather from forests and fields. In dire times, people ate what they called famine foods. These included bitter weeds, tree bark, and even boiled leather. Chronicles from the period mention cooking rats when all else failed, with one writer noting that younger ones tasted less unpleasant. Malnutrition left permanent marks on those who survived. Archaeologists still find skeletal evidence of stunted growth in children, whose bones stopped developing whenever food ran out. Adults suffered from ailments caused by vitamin shortages. Scurvy and bone-softening diseases, such as osteomalacia, were common. Because of constant hunger and poor diets, medieval people were much shorter than modern ones. Men typically stood about 5 feet 4 inches, and women about 5 feet. When people today talk about eating like their ancestors, they rarely imagine a diet that kept everyone small and sickly. Yet food scarcity was only part of the hardship. The tools used in the fields were crude and exhausting to handle. The basic plow was made mostly of wood, with only a small iron tip known as a plowshare. These wooden tools frequently broke when striking stones or hard soil. Replacing or fixing a broken plow could cost nearly 2 weeks of a farmer's wages. Even when they worked properly, they were painfully slow. Under ideal conditions, a farmer could plow just 1 acre in a day. Harvesting tools such as sickles and scythes were not much better. Forged from low-quality iron, they rusted quickly and required constant sharpening. Farmers spent long hours grinding them on stones, only for them to dull again within a few hours of labor. In many villages, tools were shared because most families could not afford their own. Records from rural England show that up to 7 households sometimes relied on a single plow, forcing each family to wait its turn while precious planting time slipped away. Owning a full set of iron tools represented a massive investment, often worth half a year's income. Many families handed tools down from parent to child, using the same worn-out equipment for generations. The physical toll of working with such rough instruments was immense. Without comfortable grips or any concern for posture, each swing or shove sent jarring pain through the body. By their 30s, many farmers suffered severe joint wear and early arthritis. Their bones bore the unmistakable signs of lifelong strain from pushing, lifting, and cutting in the fields. Even hauling water each day demanded its own rough set of tools and unending effort. Without indoor plumbing, every bit of water used for drinking, cooking, or washing had to be carried from a nearby well or stream. A single household needed roughly 20 gallons each day, adding up to more than 160 pounds of water to haul. The containers used to store it were just as crude as the tools. Grain was kept in clay pots or wooden barrels that often leaked or absorbed moisture, ruining part of the harvest. Tools for handling crops were simple flails, which required endless hours of pounding to separate grain from the husks. It was like trying to crack hundreds of candy shells with nothing but a stick. The process was slow, exhausting, and frustrating beyond measure. Accidents were frequent and sometimes deadly. A single cut from a rusted blade could turn fatal without any medical help. What made life even harder was the complete lack of machinery or clever devices to ease the load. There were no engines, no gears, and no water pumps, only human and animal strength pushing against primitive tools. Every bundle of hay, every stone for building, every sack of grain had to be lifted and moved by hand. Yet even this daily hardship was not the worst burden. The deeper misery was that most farmers had almost no control over their own lives. The idea of personal freedom simply did not exist for the majority. Most peasants were tied to the very land they worked, unable to leave without permission. This condition, known as serfdom, covered nearly 60% of Europe's rural population at its height. It was a status you were born into, like inheriting a lifelong sentence you could never escape. Serfs had no right to move, to marry, or to change their work without their lord's consent. Want to live in the next village? You had to pay a large fee. Want to marry someone from another estate? That cost even more. Historical documents mention a tax called merchet, a payment made simply to gain permission to marry, and it could equal an entire year's earnings. Courtship was costly long before the invention of fancy dinners. Children had no choice but to follow in their parents' footsteps. Farming was not a career option. It was an obligation. By the time they were 6 or 7, children joined their parents in the fields, and by 12, they were expected to handle the same workload as any adult. Schooling was almost unheard of. Fewer than 1 in 20 peasants could read or write, and the thought of a farmer becoming a trader or craftsman was pure fantasy. Most people never traveled beyond their local area. Studies of surviving records show that many peasants lived their entire lives within a 10-mile circle of their birthplace. Their world was smaller than a modern university campus. The most exciting trip they might take was walking to a nearby village for the yearly fair, provided their lord allowed it. Defying local authority could bring harsh consequences. Court records describe people punished publicly for small acts like talking back to officials. Some were forced to stand in the village square, holding heavy stones for hours, while others endured time in the stocks or brutal whippings. Ordinary farmers had no voice in local government. Village councils and manorial courts were dominated by landowners and churchmen. The steward of the estate decided when to plant, when to harvest, and how much of the crop would go to the lord as rent. Complaining did no good. Questioning authority could mean losing your home or being marked as a troublemaker. Because education was scarce, most peasants could neither read nor write, leaving them easy targets for exploitation. Whenever they needed help understanding a contract or agreement, they had to rely on someone else to read it to them. Many were deceived or overcharged because they had no way to check what was written. Taxes could change at the lord's whim. One season he might demand 1/3 of your grain, and the next he might take half. Records describe extra charges for everything from repairing castle walls to paying ransom when a noble's relative was captured in war. Medieval tax time was like its modern version, except the collector carried a sword instead of a briefcase. For most farmers, life paths were decided at birth, and breaking free from the soil was nearly impossible. If you were born into a family of farmers, you would spend your whole life as one. Trying to flee your village without permission was a serious crime. You could be chased down, dragged back, and punished in front of everyone. Some manors even employed men whose only task was to hunt down runaway serfs and bring them back to face justice. The grim truth was that the medieval farming system was built to trap people where they started. Poor, uneducated, and always working to fill someone else's granaries. Farmers were bound by invisible chains stronger than iron. Their plows and hoes could be mended, but their lowly social rank never changed. Yet even these human-made hardships seemed small compared to what happened when nature turned against them. Modern people might grumble when it rains on a weekend picnic, but medieval farmers watched the sky with dread. The weather decided everything, whether they would eat that winter or starve before spring. For them, weather was not a mild inconvenience, but a constant gamble that could erase months of work in a single storm. Droughts were the worst. With no modern wells or irrigation canals, every harvest depended entirely on the rain. One dry season could wipe out up to 70% of a village's grain. Farmers would have gladly traded their best ox for a modern sprinkler. To them, even a small puddle felt like a blessing from heaven. Too much rain, however, could be just as deadly. Drainage ditches dug by hand could not protect fields from flooding. After long downpours, farmlands often turned into shallow lakes. The rain-soaked summer of 1315 brought such ruin that crops failed across Europe, sparking a famine that lasted 2 years and claimed nearly 10% of the population. Cold snaps were another killer. A single night of frost in early autumn could destroy entire fields of grain. Medieval farmers had no forecasts or warnings to prepare for sudden chills, only proverbs and superstition. Old sayings about red skies might have sounded wise, but they could not save the harvest when icy winds came too soon. A violent storm could flatten acres of crops before anyone had time to react. Without modern alerts or shelters, people simply endured whatever nature threw at them. It often felt as if the weather itself was playing a cruel game with their lives, and the consequences reached beyond the fields. Most peasant homes had straw roofs that leaked when it rained. During severe snowfalls, the weight could crush the weak structures. Records from northern England tell of families buried alive when their roofs collapsed under heavy snow. Winters were long, dark, and punishing. Inside their houses, temperatures often fell below freezing. Medieval clothing was all about survival, not fashion. The goal was to pile on as many layers as possible and still be able to swing an axe. Farm animals suffered alongside their owners. Barns provided little warmth or shelter from the cold, and an icy winter could wipe out flocks and herds in weeks. Losing animals meant losing meat, milk, and the strength needed to plow next year's fields. Even pests seemed to join forces with the weather. Wet years brought swarms of rats and mice that invaded granaries, chewing through what little food was left. Monks at St. Alban's Abbey recorded years when rodents devoured more grain than people could harvest, leaving entire villages close to starvation. But the greatest test was not the weather or hunger. It was the physical cost of survival itself. The life of a farmer wore the body down from childhood. Children barely old enough to stand were sent to help with chores. By 6, they gathered eggs, fetched water, or guarded crops from birds. Every day from dawn until dark, the work never stopped. Bending, hauling, cutting, lifting muscles strained, backs curved, and joints stiffened before adulthood. By the time most farmers reached middle age, their bodies were already broken by years of endless labor on unforgiving soil. Examinations of medieval skeletons reveal just how brutal farming life really was. Many show crushed vertebrae and severe joint damage in people barely 25 years old. Their spines looked like they had been used as the village pathway. Countless bones display clear evidence of slipped discs and wear that would make anyone today cringe in sympathy. The endless motions of cutting and threshing tools left distinct scars on the body. Swinging a scythe or flail for decades created unique patterns of stress on the shoulder bones. In fact, one research team discovered that they could often identify a medieval farmer's skeleton simply by studying the worn right shoulder joint. Their bones carried the memory of hard labor long after the rest of them was gone. Feet took a terrible beating, too. Most shoes were made from coarse leather or even plaited straw, offering almost no support. During the warmer seasons, many farmers worked barefoot, exposing their feet to stones, splinters, and sharp thorns. Imagine stepping on a field littered with jagged rocks or a stray iron nail. One bad cut could turn fatal if infection set in, and with no antibiotics, even small wounds could kill. Cleanliness was another constant battle. Water was too valuable to waste on bathing, and most of it was reserved for cooking or drinking. Washing the body was a rare event, sometimes done only a few times a year. Clothes were worn until they literally fell apart. Lice and fleas were so widespread that they rarely received mention in official documents unless they caused extreme infestations. Skin conditions were routine. People suffered from constant itching, sores, and fungus from wearing the same damp clothing for months. Scabies, caused by mites that burrow under the skin, was practically universal and had countless local nicknames across Europe. Relief was almost impossible to find. Home cures often made matters worse. The deadliest threats came from the water itself. Wells and streams were easily polluted by animal waste or human refuse. Diseases such as dysentery and typhoid frequently swept through entire villages, striking children and the elderly first. One medieval medical guide even suggested testing a water's safety by checking its color, advice that was useless against invisible bacteria. Parasites were an unavoidable part of life. Studies of preserved remains show that more than 4 out of 5 people carried intestinal worms. These invaders drained what little nourishment their hosts consumed, leading to exhaustion, weakness, and stunted growth. The typical medieval farmer carried more uninvited guests than a low-cost inn offering free breakfast. Medical treatment was primitive when it existed at all. Most villages lacked a trained healer or physician. Instead, people turned to neighbors skilled in herbal lore or prayer. For broken bones, they used simple wooden splints and willow bark tea for pain. For infected wounds, they sometimes applied moldy bread, which occasionally helped since some molds produced natural antibiotics. Still, for most serious sicknesses, survival depended entirely on luck. Women faced even greater risks. Childbirth was a leading cause of death among peasant women. Without midwives or sterile tools, the dangers were immense. Historical accounts suggest that 1 out of 5 women died during childbirth or soon afterward from infection or blood loss. Those who lived often endured lifelong injuries. The average farmer's lifespan hovered between 30 and 40 years. Yet this number hides the real truth. Many children never reached adulthood, but those who did might live into their 50s if fortune allowed. Their later years, however, were spent in bodies wrecked by years of heavy labor, starvation, and disease. All the hardship, all the labor, all the pain, for what reward? A life chained to survival, with no hope of advancement or rest. A world where one bad harvest could erase everything you had built. A society that saw farmers not as people, but as tools to till the soil. So now the question remains, do you still think you could endure it?